Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to episode 56 of Keeping Water. This week's episode is going to be a little different. It's an episode I've planned to do for a while, but for a variety of reasons, a lack of filming opportunities this week, work, not a lot going on in the pond, aside from it being blue, all have kind of meant it seems a good time to do it now. So, as the title suggests, I'm going to take a look at the pond's progression by comparing four aspects: the fish, the filtration, the plants, and the pond. By the pond I mean the actual hole in the ground that I dug and filled with water. Anyway, it's a long time since episodes 1 and 2 and the retro episodes that somewhat covered similar ground, so I think it will give newer viewers an idea of the pond from the start, as well as giving a better comparison and review. As I said, not much change in the pond this week. I've just finished the second dose of antiparasite treatment. The fish are eating and active and all seems well, aside from the numerous white marks on them. However, as the treatment also makes viewing them pretty difficult, I'm going to wait for the water clarity to get better, when I'll take a closer look, probably not to see completely cured fish, but hopefully some improvement. I've had a really good week for new subscribers. Thank you all so much if you're one of them. I really am grateful. As I said a couple of weeks ago, I'm planning a 500 subs giveaway, and I've already started collecting stuff for it. For me, it's still a fair way off, about February next year at my current rate. But I'm not wealthy or sponsored, so I'm stocking up now so that when I do get there, the giveaway will be a worthy thank you to everyone who has supported the channel. With luck, the next two episodes will either be some tinkering upgrades to the filters, a final consolidation and review of the carp's health, or a somewhat different video about a mysterious hunt and possible discovery in the pond. We'll see. But to get this week's video started, I'll look first at the pond. My aim when I first planned the shape of the pond was to go for that elusive dream of creating a natural look. In doing so, there's always the temptation to plump for a kidney bowl shape, which I did really, mostly because it has curves and looks like natural lakes, but also as you don't lose too much potential space as you might when avoiding right angles and straight lines too much. Placing it was tricky. I had to avoid things underground, I won't go into details, and I wanted to ensure space all the way around it, access to the back gate, and leave some space for raised beds, all in what is quite a small garden. Now, there's a few words of wisdom about how big to make your pond, including make it as big as you've got room, to make it part of the garden, not all of the garden. I didn't really have much choice, to be honest. I wanted a pond big enough for reasonably large carp, plus a shoal of rudd, so around 10,000 litres was preferred. Consequently, it was inevitably going to take over my small garden somewhat. Additionally, I'm not a fan of cutting the grass, so I really didn't mind losing the lawn. So this was the pond once I finished all the digging and before putting the liner in. I was pretty pleased with the overall shape and felt the hard work had paid off. It would have been even better if it was level. The current pond, or version 2, is broadly speaking the same basic footprint. Back in 2018 I redug the pond, taking out the bottom level and some of the marginal shelf and increased the depth to just over 4 feet at the deepest point. In addition, I mostly addressed it not being level and improved the marginal shelves to stop the plant baskets falling off. So the hole in the ground I have now looks pretty much the same as it did then. However, I think that replacing the marginal shelf along the rear edge and planting the wall of overhanging plants adds positively to the overall aesthetic. Additionally, in terms of functionality, the pond just works better. It's deeper, which is always a good thing. The plants stay on the shelves, as I've said. The pond is mostly level, which means it's possible to keep the maximum amount of water in it. And with the third level removed, the fish have more swimming space and a larger volume of water. One final difference between pond version 1 and pond version 2 is the waterfall. I installed one when I first made the pond, and aside from it leaking and collecting algae, it was pretty nice. The liner around it, not so much, but I liked it nevertheless. I considered adding one to the second version, but time, money, and also just being really indecisive meant it was skipped fairly late on in the second build. The final similarity is the liner. I'm pretty awful at installing it, and I'm not sure I got any better with the second attempt. In my defence, it's a pretty tricky shape to get neat. Next, plants. From the outset, I knew I wanted marginal plants around most of the pond, partly to hide the liner, but mostly to create a more natural look and soften the edge between the ground and water. It took a long time to build up enough plants, and I also swapped out some types over time, which obviously needed replacing. Through the early stages of the pond, therefore, it often looked a bit bare, not only looking less natural, but also revealing more of the liner than I'd like. Now, I don't really know the names of lots of the plants I've used. I know the irises and the lilies, and that's about it. There's a few grassy ones, some that look like green bamboo, and some that look a little like the grassy ones and a little like the irises. I also don't really have a plan about how to plant them, what would work best, whether to separate them into different types or to mix them up. I also occasionally added them amongst rocks. It's all really been trial and error and making it up as I go along. Into the second version though, and after keeping them in a dog pool while I rebuilt the pond, as everyone does, I returned them. This time, I did by and large separate by species, keeping the irises mostly to the right side and the grassy looking ones to the left. With the marginal shelf newly levelled and the plants placed quite tightly together, they would no longer fall into the pond at the slightest wind or for seemingly no reason at all, as they often did. I'm not entirely sure they look much better though. They hide the liner more successfully, but there's a number of things that detract from the overall aesthetic. For example, they're too tall, and pruning them, at least me pruning them, doesn't really make them look any better. They're messy, although that's mostly down to my skill in plant arrangement, and to be honest, I suppose I can pretend it looks more natural, as natural tends not to be uniform. Additionally, they help to block the pond against heron. Not 100%, but they certainly make things harder for them, and in conjunction with the fence, they have worked, so far at least. In comparison to the first version, the new one therefore wins. They're more robust, they hide the liner as well as can be expected, they grow well, and they provide plenty of living and feeding spaces for bees and dragonflies. Where the first version's planting wins, and is something I want to address next year, are the lilies. Although I didn't really know how to look after them, which meant they didn't really flourish, they were just great, providing a natural look, cover for the fish, and more flowers for other wildlife. I'm definitely going to have lilies again. I need to think of a way to disguise the baskets or whatever I plant them in to try and retain a natural underwater look and to protect the fish from injuring themselves on them. Then I think version 2 will be as good as I can possibly make it plants-wise. On to filters. This is probably the area where there's been the biggest improvement and progression. I started like many new pond keepers with a pump and a pressure filter, and that was it. Now, not only was it not a particularly effective filter, it was a nightmare to clean. The easy clean function barely worked and then broke, and the clip to reseal the lid was annoying to get right. To address the basic lack of biological filtration, I took the second step that new pond keepers often do and added a black box filter with some sponges and not particularly effective plastic media. And to be honest, I didn't really have any water quality issues. However, I was extremely cautious with feeding, and there were less and overall smaller fish than I have now. But there were other problems. A pipe from the pressure filter to the black box came off and the pond drained. The pressure filter continued to be a pain, and I was worried about the fish both getting bigger and increasing in number, especially as the rudd had just spawned. So the next progression was to get a multi-bay, the same one I have now. I think multi-bays are occasionally underestimated. They do a pretty good job of both mechanical and biofiltration. Their most prominent downside being that they're labour intensive to get clean and you've got to get your hands mucky. Anyway, I finished off the additions to version 1 of the pond's filtration with a UV and aeration to use the K1 chamber as a moving bed. To be honest, it was pretty good and basically the same as I have now. Nearly. But a proper disaster hit the pond in winter 2018. The pond basically froze and all but the tench and some rudd survived, so it was time for a rebuild of the pond. But I also took in consideration how the filtration could be improved, with an eye of keeping it protected a little better from freezing temperatures. So, for version 2 of the pond, I put the filtration in a shed and ran most of the pipework either underground or underwater. The multi-bay and UV initially remained unchanged. The following year I added a skimmer, which is one of those things I think that you only really appreciate it when you have one and it stops working, if that makes sense. This year I've added a moving bed, a pseudo upflow chamber and filter floss into the skimmer box. It goes without saying that the current filtration works far better than the original pressure filter, in spite of having larger and more numerous fish and heavier feeding. But equally it cost about 5 times as much too, so you'd expect that. It remains pretty labour intensive to clean and takes over 3 hours of work each week to keep things healthy. In the short to medium term, I don't really have the means to make any significant changes to it, and as long as it continues to perform, aside from wanting to avoid work, I don't really have any reason to. But there's one thing that all iterations of the pond have in common, that's been in use since day one of the pond, and that's the pump. It's a 13,000 litre an hour pump that has never let me down, and shows no signs of doing so in the future. Although I'd really like a vari pump of some sort, this one will do for now. Next and finally, onto the fish. The whole point, for me at least, was to provide a home for fish, particularly at the outset for the carp. The stocking, although all but one of the fish is different now to the early stages of the pond, basically remains the same in terms of mix of species. The first fish that went into the pond were 2 carp, a mirror and a common, and 5 rudd that my son had in a fish tank. The carp were the usual garden centre types, one even had a missing ventral fin, but they were great fish in their own way, and began to grow large and flourish once in the pond. The rudd were all golden rudd, my one concession to a natural theme, but equally flourished and matured once in the pond, eventually, as you'll know from recent episodes, spawning. I also added a tench, which while hiding for the first month or so, also flourished over time. Version 2 fish are similar. There's 13 rudd, 2 carp and the same tench as version 1. Additionally, there are around 22 new rudd fry, and in late October and early November there'll hopefully be 2 more carp. It feels a little unkind to compare fish too harshly, however the 2 carp I have now are of a better quality and are growing steadily. The rudd, being the offspring from the original 5 from version 1, are basically the same, although 5 are silver rudd, which I quite like. That there are more, I also like, which will only increase, hopefully, as the fry develop. The combination of rudd and carp is a good one, I think. The constantly moving, brighter coloured rudd contrasts well with the darker, mostly slower moving and larger carp. The short-lived experiments with crucian carp and longer period with additional tench didn't work out in the end, but I think have got me to a stage where the stocking and mix is perfect. It's not significantly different to version 1, but in those small ways of quality, size and number means the pond feels like a more matured, natural and flourishing environment, which, after all, was the aim. Thanks very much for watching this episode of Keeping Water. I really do appreciate it. I'd love your thoughts, good and bad, your thumbs up or thumbs down, and I'd really appreciate a subscription. It would also be great if you'd return next week for episode 57 and maybe take a look at some of my older videos if you've not seen them. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.